One of the amazing things about watching anime over the years is how it can show you your own growth as a person. I've talked in my series on Evangelion about how I related to Shinji in my youth and couldn't relate to the other characters in the show for largely the same reasons that he couldn't, until I grew up, understood people better, and was able to empathize with the rest of the show's incredible cast as well. When I was learning to write on my anime blog in the late 2000s, I was made to realize by the critique of readers and friends how one cannot simply state your impressions of the thing you watch and expect people to understand your conclusions or why you think of something the way you do, nor will they feel any reason to respect an unjustified perspective. Luckily, being the lexical thinker that I am, it came naturally to dedicate myself to perfecting the systems of communication by which I reach my audience, that being primarily words, which have flown from my mouth and hands like a fountain ever since I was a small child. In my recent series of videos discussing my theory of human neurotypes, I have described Japan as an exceptionally lexical, rules-driven culture. It's not a surprise that art would be used as a means of repudiation and escape from that intensely logical culture, but the people creating and consuming that art are still living within and being held to the expectations of that culture. Japanese light novels are often seen as something like novels written by people who've only ever watched anime, but this wasn't really how they began. The early light novels were great not because they were attempting to capture and comment on the culture of anime fandom, but on the actual mindset of Japanese otaku themselves. Lateral thinking obsessives who spend all their time massively consuming and comparing media would make stories about their experiences to be enjoyed by other people with similar experiences, and the cycle continues. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that I consider light novels to be fairly lexical in nature, given that they are in fact comprised of language, but I actually think that most fiction writing is much more impressionistic than many of the light novels from writers like Nishio Isin or Kohei Kadono. Whereas traditional fiction tends to fixate more on sensory detail in setting a scene and to try and tell self-contained stories, light novels have a tendency to strip out much of the sensory detail in favor of fixating on the narrator's train of thought and interpretations of events around them. Light novels are more dialogue than detail-driven and tend to be built directly to involve the tropes and meta-context understood by their expected audience. Nishio Isin is in particular the portrait of a hyperlexical and hyperlateral thinker, a person completely consumed with words to the point that he goes to insane lengths to be extremely specific while building esoteric puns out of unique kanji readings and shit. The guy couldn't write in a more fundamentally analytical way, and when I first saw that translated to animation when Bakemonogatari aired in 2009, my knee-jerk reaction was honestly to find it rather trite. You see, the problem with piece of shit 18-year-old me is that I had a tendency to have no idea what the fuck was actually going on in the shows that I watched, because I straight up lacked the perspective to appreciate what was really being said. Maybe on some level I felt the show going over my head, as I'm sure I got lost in the flurries of quick and layered dialogue coupled with quick and layered visuals which I wasn't doubling back to read through again to make sure I understood. I think I felt that the gist of the show was enough to understand it, and my overall feeling of the show was that it was basically good in the same ways that all the other stuff I already liked was good, including the author's own Zaregoto, and therefore not particularly noteworthy. My tune changed by the end of the first season, especially when the last 3 episodes finally dropped, and I became enough of a fan of the show that by 2014 I made a nearly hour-long analysis of everything that existed up to that point. I make some good arguments in that video and some shaky ones, but more importantly, I just don't care all that much anymore about the angle of approach I took, because I clearly was still stuck in the mindset of trying to be smarter than and or get one over on Nishio Isin or something, given that my approach was critiquing arc by arc the story's level of meaningfulness versus what I saw as empty self-indulgence. When I finished the first season of Monogatari back in 2009, what finally got me to truly connect with it was how closely I related to Koyomi. I can compare myself in so many ways, but suffice it to say that we think very similarly with very similar results. It's amazingly telling, however, that Senjougahara had left nearly no impact on me whatsoever the first time I finished the show. I described her in one post as having been written profoundly, beautifully, and to be quite fun. However, as I put it, I couldn't get along with her in real life. We'll get to why that's hilarious later. In my 2014 review of the show, I declared that much of the dialogue is mimetic, unnatural, and unimportant. I guess you could fairly say that it's mimetic and unnatural as a result of the characters themselves thinking in mimetic and unnatural ways as per the author's tendency, but unimportant? I think it's a pretty hard sell to say that about any dialogue in any show. At the time I wrote that review, I'd recently broken up with my first girlfriend after about 6 months. It is telling that my take on Senjougahara at the time was that she was poor at communicating, that she knows what she wants to say, but not how to say it. What I described in my analysis at the time is an almost verbatim description of impressionistic and lateral thought, as described in my neurotyping video, which isn't a surprise since I named the Fascinator category after Senjougahara in the first place. But really, it was my relationship with my current fiancé whom I place partially into that category, which allowed me to better define the ideas of impressionistic thought and the descriptions of the upper right categories on the graph in the first place. And it is through her that I am now smart enough to know that Senjougahara was only ever as poor at communicating as Araragi was, just in a completely different fashion. Being a lexical thinker doesn't mean that you don't have instinctual impressions or understandings. It means that you doubt or ignore them in favor of logic. It can simply speak to a lack of confidence on some level, usually couched in a feeling that you lack enough experience to know what to do in any given situation, a tendency to hide behind your natural logistical reaction to new data as the reasonable way to live, even though so much of thought and communication is necessarily impressionistic, and sitting there analyzing everything doesn't make a decision happen. It is a common trope in anime for boys to be as dense as a fucking brick about recognizing someone's feelings, but in the smart shows it's more than that. It's a reticence to listen to your gut, a fear that it'll be your own fault when things go wrong, and so it's better to leave that kind of decision making in the hands of other people. But lexical manipulations do not work on emotions. They can push them away and deny them, but they can't get rid of them or override them as a matter of course. Pretending that you don't know the things that you don't literally know but do feel inside is its own kind of lie in the eyes of an impressionistic thinker. But to the so-called reasonable thinker, that is a definitely unreasonable mindset. Much of Nisio Isin's writing is primarily about communication between people who think in different ways and the difficulties of becoming aligned in perspective. Araragi and Senjougahara are both lateral thinkers with a tendency to encircle an idea endlessly before finding their way into the heart of it, to start at the end and work their way to the origin. Hitagi struggles to boil things down into words, and Araragi struggles to appreciate nuance. They both talk past one another or connect in unexpected ways, get different things out of the same events, and eventually catch up when they realize where the misunderstandings began. It's a show about working through the hiccups in understanding between people whose understandings are insanely specific thanks to the weird events of their lives, just like everyone. At the end of the day, it's just a boy meets girl story from the perspective of an obsessive human analyst with a powerful fascination for art hoes. Can relate. When I started to understand Hitagi, I started to like her and think she was hot, but I couldn't have really appreciated her until I was old enough to actually step outside of myself and my connection to Araragi and understand the things that he doesn't understand. Not just noticing that Hitagi's communication is falling flat, but that Araragi isn't picking up on the message even though it's right in front of him. But us being so alike, how was I supposed to know what he couldn't figure out? I'm sure if Araragi got the chance to watch the episode back himself, he'd point to this in that moment and say, "That's the part where I fucked up and misinterpreted everything." Monogatari's dialogue is too good to be real because the communication between the characters is too bad to be fake. No matter how ridiculous it all seems, you can't help but get drawn into the winding road that you hope will make it to the creamy center every time. I'll be watching the Monogatari series to completion finally, and I'll let you know what I think. The Otoganzo tape series is funded through the crowdfunding website Patreon. To check out more of my content and all of its massive variety, head over to my extremely organized playlists on the front page of my channel. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.